Good afternoon. You're watching the English newscast on Future Television. I'm Yumna Nawfal, and these are today's top stories. Donald Trump huddling with his White House transition team over cabinet picks as the president-elect says he is open to keeping part of Obama's signature healthcare law. Syrian government forces regained control of areas they lost over the past 2 weeks to a rebel offensive on the edge of the northern city of Aleppo. And Iraqi forces engaged in intense fighting with extremists in eastern Mosul as civilians gathered on the city's outskirts flee. Prime Minister-designate Saad Hariri spoke by telephone with U.S. President-elect Donald Trump last night, congratulating him on his election victory and discussing with him ways of expanding cooperation between the two countries. The phone conversation was an occasion for a quick review of Lebanese-American relations and the horizons of cooperation between Lebanon and the new U.S. administration. Hariri and Trump agreed to continue contacts and consultations in the interest of the two countries and two peoples and the friendships between them. Hariri's call came a day after President Michel Aoun sent a cable to Trump congratulating him on his election as president and expressing hope for strengthening cooperation between the Lebanon and the United States. Syrian government forces regained control of areas they lost over the past 2 weeks to a rebel offensive on the edge of the northern city of Aleppo, ending a major attempt by insurgents to break the siege on eastern parts of the city. An activist group and pro-government media are saying the insurgents had seized a couple of strategic areas in western Aleppo after launching an offensive on October 28 in an attempt to break the siege imposed in July on rebel-held eastern Aleppo, which has also been targeted by waves of Syrian and Russian airstrikes. Russia said last month it would halt the airstrikes on the city and urged insurgents to leave. But the fighters, including members of the al-Qaeda-linked Fatah al-Sham, refused to leave after the government opened corridors for them to cross to the nearby province of Idlib. Iraqi forces engaged in intense fighting with extremists in eastern Mosul, an officer says, as civilians are gathered on the city's outskirts and are beginning to flee. Iraqi forces launched a massive operation to retake the country's second city from Daesh on October 17th, and the Counter-Terrorism Service Special Forces has pushed the extremists back from some Mosul neighborhoods. But there are still weeks, if not months, of fighting ahead in the battle to recapture the last ISIS-held Iraqi city. And aid workers are warning that displacement may spike as Iraqi troops push deeper into Mosul. As fighting raged deeper in the city, civilians, some of them carrying white flags, walked towards its outskirts, gathering near an Iraqi military truck that would take them out to the city for safety. Coming up next, we speak with political commentator Michael Moschella to try to discuss what exactly happened after the U.S. elections. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Future Television. On the line, joining us live from New York City, is political commentator Michael Moschella. Michael, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Yumna. Great to be on.
Donald Trump is currently huddling with the White House transition team for a second day over cabinet picks as the president-elect says he is open to keeping parts of President Barack Obama's signature health care law still there. Now, the billionaire real estate mogul said in interviews he would consider an amended version of the 2010 law. So is he softening his approach after vowing on the campaign to repeal the measure?
Definitely, and I think he'll soften his approach on a lot of the campaign promises that he made as he gets into actually trying to govern, which is much different than showmanship and campaigning that a person like Donald Trump is used to. Now he's going to realize how difficult it is to actually change major policies. And I don't think he's going to want to do things like take healthcare away from sick people that are completely dependent for their lives on a certain policy. It's going to be very, very challenging to do that. And he's going to have a very interesting 4 years trying to figure out what to do.
Michael, what do you make of this, of what's happened? Not just, we'll talk about the elections in a minute, but, he went to visit President Barack Obama at the White House. Afterwards tweeted that it went very smoothly, that they spent an hour and 15 minutes talking, and that he would consider keeping a few things that he had previously said no, he wouldn't. And then we just seem to have just witnessed a much different Donald Trump than what we're used to. But what do we make of it? I mean, we're saying it was just showmanship, but he did get elected because of the things he vowed and he promised to do.
Yeah. So in the United States, we have a very strong tradition of both sides coming together after an election and doing everything they can to ensure a smooth transition. And we have had far more bitter rivals than Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, if you can imagine that, who've been able to ensure a smooth transition. Because the last thing you want is to go into a monarchy or a dictatorship where one party refuses to get power.
Do you think he's going to build that wall? I mean, that's a question a lot of people are talking about, and it's always a point of contention.
Maybe out of Legos. It's going to be very difficult to build the wall because actually most of that border is along a river and along farmland. So you can't really put a wall on the banks of a river that is a floodplain. I think there are certain things about United States border security that could certainly be reinforced, and Donald Trump is going to do everything he can to reinforce them. The irony being that during President Obama's administration, we have a record low amount of immigration from Mexico. So he's going to start to run up against the legal and institutional hurdles for building a wall. Will there be something? Yes. Will it be a wall? Almost certainly not.
All right, and definitely not having Mexico pay for it, I think, as he had recently said. This reshuffling comes as a lot of anti-Trump protesters are spilling onto the streets of different cities, with the Republican facing mounting calls to reassure Americans who fear a xenophobic crackdown under his authority. Now, these people, they're carrying signs saying, "You're not my president. Your wall can't stand in our way." And it's a third night in a row now. I mean, I think a lot of people did not expect this to happen and feel betrayed, probably by the media, by the polls. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's legitimate to be concerned, especially if you are a minority, a person of color. President Trump has said some really, really disparaging things about minority groups in the country. I also think that at the end of the day, there are incredibly strong systems to protect those groups here. A group called the American Civil Liberties Union that exists to protect minority rights had their website crash because they were getting so many donations. There are still a tremendous number of Democratic governors and legislators around the country that have a lot of control over things like police forces.
We talked. I want to just get in a question there. I don't want to get into how the polls got it wrong because they've been talking about that for the last 4 days. But what do you make of the people? And it's pretty obvious right now that hadn't probably publicly stated that they were voting for Trump, but then alone in their booth, they were able to overturn states like Wisconsin, which hadn't gone Democrat in a while, Pennsylvania, North Carolina. I mean, it seemed that was it just Hillary being unpopular, or was it fear? Was it that they really actually he spoke for them? He called out to the people. What went wrong there? What did we not see coming?
There are two things that happened. The first is President Obama was able to turn out a tremendous number of minority and young voters and voters who just wanted change. And Hillary Clinton didn't do as good a job turning those voters out. The second thing that happened was there's a group of voters in the United States that are working class, typically white voters, typically live outside of cities. And those folks really rebelled against Hillary Clinton. They viewed her as a Washington elite who was completely out of touch with their lives.
Well, why do you think they publicly didn't state it?
Well, I think that probably they had coworkers that were talking about some of the really ridiculous things that Trump said, and while they felt deep down inside that they really didn't like Hillary Clinton, they didn't want to get into the fight. They didn't want to get into the argument. They just wanted to go and cast a real serious protest.
As a Democrat yourself, are you? It's been a few days. How do you feel about what's to come? They keep talking about the first 100 days of Donald Trump in the office and the cabinet that he's putting together, actually assigning a few of those of that transition to his sons and daughter.
Mm-hmm. Keep in mind, a lot of the real conservative leaders in this country signed pledges not to work with Donald Trump. So he has a pretty narrow bench and a kind of a small pool of brain power to pull from, which was the exact opposite for President Obama.
Do you think they're going to stick to those pledges, though? Because he does have the Senate, he does have Congress, both Republicans right now. So how do you? Yeah. I mean, he's got things on his side. We can't say he doesn't.
Absolutely. He does. At the same time, the Republican Party is still deeply divided. And I think there's going to be a lot of internal fighting between different factions, especially on issues like foreign policy and economic policy. The Republican Party itself is going to have to determine a direction, and that's not going to be an easy fight. So I look for, out of the gate, the first 100, 200 days to see a pretty rocky transition and probably not much happening in the way of a real concerted push for change as the Republican Party itself sorts out its own issues.
I know you talked about the Republican Party being divided, but the day after the elections, CNN had this title, One President, Two Americas. It's not just the Republican Party that seems divided today, as these protests show, and as people have been commenting, talking. America seems divided, does it not?
Yeah, and America is a big place. There's 300 million people here. It's
right, so
easy
to be divided if you're counting the numbers, what you're saying. Right.
Right. There are very different groups and types of people here, and California is very different from Oklahoma, and that's kind of always been the way it is. The question will be, how divided we are, not just culturally, but on policy at the end of the day. And there are a lot of things that Americans agree on. We want higher wages for people that work hard. We want to have a great education system, not just the best higher education system in the world, but we want to have a great secondary education system. We want to make sure that people have access to doctors. So there are many things that, while the country is very divided, that we still agree on, and the Congress will have to figure out how to navigate that.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Yuna.
Thank you. That was political commentator Michael Moschella discussing Trump and the protests and what's been happening in the United States for the last week. And on that note, we end our bulletin. Here's a reminder of our headlines. Donald Trump huddling with his White House transition team over cabinet picks as the president-elect says he is open to keeping parts of Obama's signature health care law. Syrian government forces regained control of areas they lost over the past 2 weeks to a rebel offensive on the edge of Aleppo. And Iraqi forces engaged in intense fighting with extremists in eastern Mosul as citizens begin to flee. Those are your Saturday headlines live on Future Television. Catch us again tomorrow for all the latest. Have a good one.